Okay, everybody. So we're going to talk about voting behavior. Please excuse my nasally congested radio voice here. All right, but here we go. So, just to give you a profile of what the American voter looks like, when we talk about turnout rates, what we're doing is we are talking about the proportion of the voting age public that votes, not the proportion of registered voters that vote, but the proportion of all people 18 and older that go ahead and vote. Now, as I mentioned, the United States has some of the lowest turnout rates in the world, but if we look at the turnout rate of those people registered to vote, it's actually much, much higher. So the real turnout rate, the proportion of the voting age public that votes, is about 50% for the United States. But if we look at the turnout for registered voters, it actually goes up to between 70 and 80%. So that's a much nicer number. So on average, about 40% of the eligible adult population votes, and 25% are occasional voters. Just kind of if they feel moved by a particular election or candidate, they may or may not turn out. What we do know, though, is that voters overall tend to be more educated than non-voters. Voters are going to have higher incomes. Young people, such as yourself, especially in the age group of 18 to 24, you guys have the lowest turnout rate, mainly because you believe that politicians don't really care about you or address any of your issues. And plus, you're away at college having fun. Voting isn't, a huge priority. All right, we also know that whites tend to turn out to vote more regularly than African Americans, and this kind of goes back to income and education. Whites are more likely to be more educated and have higher incomes than African Americans, so that explains the turnout rate. Hispanics vote even less than African Americans, and they are a relatively new and expanding ethnic group in the United States, and so some have citizenship, some do not. Obviously, those without can't vote. Those who are interested in politics tend to vote more. These are, as you can see, pretty much common sense. Some of these are common sense things. Men and women do tend to vote at about the same rate, but women tend to favor Democratic or liberal candidates a bit more than men. But they do turn out to vote at the same rate. And so I kind of wanted to show you some statistics from the 2008 election here. So we have, if you can see this, we have Barack Obama on the left. Just focus in on 2008 because basically, although the numbers will shift a little bit, the trends I'm going to go over here remain the same. So in 2008 over on the left, you have Obama on the left and McCain on the right. So I just want to show you some of these differences in the voting preferences of these groups. So you can see men were pretty split between Obama and McCain, 50-50. But look at this. You see a big gender gap. Women, 57% for Obama versus 43% for McCain. So there's that gender gap. Whites, as you can see, favor McCain because whites tend to be more conservative. Non-whites, huge win here for Obama, and minorities do tend to be liberal and favor the Democratic Party. Non-Hispanic whites, again, 56% for McCain, only 44% for Obama. Non-whites, which include Hispanics, overwhelmingly here in favor of Obama. Blacks, you can see, not even a question. And although, of course, President Obama is black, and you may think, oh, well, that's why blacks voted for him. You can see in these other elections here, 2004, 2000, I mean, it's not even close. Blacks are always overwhelmingly in favor of the Democratic Party. And that, of course, has to do with the fact that Lyndon Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act, and he, of course, was a Democrat. Young people, as you can see, favor the Democrats. And then that starts to fade as you get older. And so you can see clearly the really old people favoring McCain. And one of the reasons is because you tend to get more conservative as you get older because you make more money and you don't want the government to take it. So you tend to favor low taxes, and that's more of a conservative policy. Let's see what else got in here. So the college educated tended to favor Obama over McCain. Those with only a high school degree favored McCain. And those that only went to grade school favored Obama. So some interesting trends there. Liberals tend to have the very highly educated and the low educated, and then conservatives tend to be in the middle there. Um, college graduates only, meaning college graduate only, meaning they didn't go to any other graduate school. You can see 51 to 49. Postgraduate, so people have like master's degrees, doctorates, you can see they favored Obama as well. Remember I said the more education you have, the more likely you are to be liberal, except if you make a lot of money, and then you'd be more likely to be conservative. So college professor with a PhD doesn't make a lot of money, liberal. But a doctor or a lawyer, which has a lot of education, but they make a lot of money, they'll tend to be more conservative. This is really cool statistics, by the way. I'm on the Gallup organization's website to talk to you about them in the polling video. So just has some great data here. I encourage you to check it out in your free time, kind of like I am now. All right, so you have the different regions here. You can see the East tends to be more liberal. You know, they have big cities. They have a history and tradition of being liberal and having liberal values. The Midwest can tend to go either way. Just depends on how some of those swing states vote. So you can see it was kind of close here. The South really close, which of course is unusual. If you look at these other numbers here, you can see the Republican candidate clearly winning. And then the West tended to be more liberal. Of course, you got California out there, probably the most liberal state in the Union. And then I don't know why, but they're not reporting the numbers for urban, suburban, and rural areas. But your urban areas are going to be more democratic because, of course, you have more racial minorities there. You have lower incomes as well. The suburbanites will tend to go for conservatives, more white people, higher income. And then, of course, by party, I mean, 93% of Republicans voted for McCain. 93% of Democrats voted for Obama. You can see the independents were split really well. And so in any given election, it's those independent votes that the candidates are after. Because, of course, they know they're going to get their party, right? So then they're going to battle over those independents. Conservatives, you can see 77% favor McCain. He was a Republican. Moderates, Obama won here pretty handedly. And then liberals, of course, Obama's going to get. Protestants, who are the most conservative religious group, you can see they favored McCain. Catholics, also a religious group, clearly, but Catholics tend to be a bit more socially liberal, and so Catholics can be split between the two parties, but they do tend to favor the Democrats a little bit. And you can see people who go to church pretty regularly, tend to be conservative and vote that way. Those that don't tend to be liberal. You can see among married people, they tend to be more conservative, and unmarried people tend to be more liberal, probably because they're single and they're younger, make less money. You can see some of the differences here between married men and women. Let's get some of the rest here. This is the end. They don't have the business reported, but you can see unions, Obama, of course, people who are in unions tend to be liberal. Veterans, Republicans tend to support defense spending a bit more, so you can see they have an advantage there. Gun owners clearly are going to favor the Republican Party because they favor those types of policies. So anyway, I hope that chart was kind of helpful to you to show you some of the different demographic groups and their voting choices. Okay? So let's look at the excuses of the non-voter. No, their dog didn't eat their homework. They're too busy. Little Johnny's got to go to soccer. They're working. Election day is only from 7 to 7. It's only one day. And so it can be difficult sometimes for people to go and vote, although lots of areas do early voting now. So I think the too busy excuse might be a little irrelevant. Difficulty of registration. You can't vote unless you've registered to vote, and every state's registration process is different. But in general, you need to have been registered about 30 days before the election. This means you actually have to fill out some paperwork. And so that's just too much for some people. Absentee voting, if you're not going to be present at your assigned polling precinct on election day, you'll have to cast an absentee ballot. Excuse me. And the absentee ballot you need to request. They mail it to you, and it's basically a ballot that you just fill out by hand, and then you mail it back. And that's a lot of effort for some people, and so they don't do it. The number of elections, we have so many elections here in the United States, people just get tired of elections, and so they only vote in the most important ones, which are usually presidential. Voter attitudes play a role too. A lot of people are really poorly informed on the issues, and so since they're poorly informed, they just don't care, or they know when they get to their voting booth they're not going to know who to vote for, so why bother. The political parties are much weaker now. It used to be that the machines would offer you a job and someplace to live, and all you had to do was go out and vote for the local boss. But we call that bribery now, and it's strictly illegal. And so the parties don't have the same kind of incentives they can offer to get people to vote. Ballots are really long and complex. There's a number of offices to vote for. Sometimes they may be an initiative or a referendum on there, or even a constitutional amendment. And so voters kind of get put off by all of the choices they have to make, so they just don't bother. Many believe that the elections are bought by money and special interest groups. That groups like the National Rifle Association spend so much money supporting candidates that people feel like the candidates don't care about individuals. They just care about big groups and donors that can give them money. So why bother going to vote for someone that you don't think represents your interests? There's been a loss of trust in government. We've had so many scandals, Watergate, obviously, Iran-Contra, the Clinton-Lewinsky affair. It just goes on. And so, how many times can your public officials disappoint you before you start to lose trust? And if you've lost trust, then you start to feel alienated and like your vote doesn't really matter. Legal barriers. So we don't really have too many legal barriers anymore to voting. The last major one that was removed was the poll tax, but that wasn't until the 24th Amendment. And then now a lot of states are requiring that voters have voter ID cards, and that's proving to be a barrier for poor and minority voters. So that could be an issue. Cross pressures. Sometimes voters are cross pressured. So for example, what if you are a black African American female who is very religious and pro-life? You're going to be cross-pressured. Who do you vote for? And so a lot of times when voters are cross-pressured, they just don't vote at all. And then last, there are the low levels of political efficacy. Political efficacy is the degree to which you think that you can actually affect change in the political system. And since so many voters have lost their trust in the government, and they believe that their candidates are bought and sold by special interest groups, they have pretty low levels of political efficacy. So if they don't think that their vote actually matters or that they can affect any kind of change in the government, they're probably not going to spend the energy voting. Here's a chart here that just shows those reasons for not voting. I kind of went over. And then here you can see the percentage of turnout between registered and non-registered voters for these different groups. So you can pause that and look at it if you'd like. All right, so why has turnout declined so much in the 20th century? Well, we have a larger electorate. So anytime you add more people to the eligible population that can vote, the proportion of those people that do vote goes down. So you allow women to vote, turnout's going to go down. You allow 18-year-olds to vote, turnout's going to go down. Okay, it's just math. So if you think of it as a fraction, anytime you increase the number on the bottom of the fraction, you're going to have a lower percentage. We have a more mobile population with people moving around all the time. It's difficult for them to re-register to vote because you do have to re-register every time you move, even if you're just moving down the street. And then going back to that apathy and distrust and cynicism and loss of political efficacy. And then we have had a weakening of the parties. We don't have those big get out the vote pushes or incentives anymore like we used to during the time of the machines. So there have been some efforts to make voting easier to get more people to vote. Some states have adopted easier registration and absentee voting. They've allowed for same-day registration, meaning you don't have to register to vote 30 days before the election. You can actually go to the polling place and register and then go and vote. Some states have eliminated the requirement for picture ID, which helps the poor, people who don't have cars. Make election day a holiday so that everybody has off, not just white collar workers, but also fast food workers too. Strengthening the parties, giving them the ability to offer more incentives to go and vote. And then, of course, internet voting is always thrown around, but there's really no way to make that fully secure. So this graphic kind of shows you the impact that same-day registration can have. You can see those 4 states there have same-day registration. You can see their voter turnout is higher than that of the nation. So it really does seem to make a difference. All right, so what are some of the political consequences of turnout? What do you think? Do fewer voters help Republicans or Democrats? Who does higher turnout help, the incumbent or the challenger? Let's find out. I can't wait. Oh, look at that. Fewer voters actually helps Republicans. Why is that? Because if you think about the people who don't vote, poor, minority, less educated, what party would they vote for if they did vote? The Democrats. Okay, so anytime you have high turnout, it's going to help the Democrats. So that's why Republicans favor like voter ID laws that help to suppress turnout, because low turnout helps Republicans. And that's one of the reasons why President Obama did so well in his last 2 elections. We had record turnout. And so when you have record turnout, that means groups that traditionally don't vote are voting. And those groups that traditionally don't vote tend to vote Democrat. So I hope that makes sense. Who does higher turnout help, the incumbent or the challenger? Usually helps the challenger, because if you're pretty okay with the status quo, you'll probably just stay home. But if you're upset or fired up about something, you're probably going to the polls, and that means that you're going to unseat the incumbent. All right, so how do we explain the choices that voters make? Well, individual voters can make choices. Individual voters make can be analyzed basically as a product of long-term and short-term forces. Okay, so party identification is the most important long-term factor. Your party identification is the party you identify with. So if you're a Democrat, you're going to vote for Democrats. If you're a Republican, you're going to vote for Republicans. This may seem like common sense, but it was actually the thesis of a 500-page book called The American Voter, written in the 1950s. And it was a breaking new theory at the time. Short-term forces vary from election to election. These are things that can change. Long-term forces don't really change. So the short-term force would be like the candidate's attributes, their background, their education, their personality, their image, as well as the candidate's stances on the issues, the economy too, and those are short-term forces. So basically your long-term factor, your party ID, combined with the short-term forces in any given election are going to determine vote choice. All right. Additionally, we can explain voter choice by prospective and retrospective voting. So when one votes prospectively, you're voting based on a candidate's promises made during the campaign. When you vote retrospectively, you're voting based on the past performance of a candidate or his or her party in office. So that's why a lot of times, even if the candidate's a challenger, if their party is someone from their party is the current incumbent, it can really hurt them. So in 2008, John McCain had a really hard time because, of course, George Bush was the incumbent, and the Republican Party was not very popular. And so people voted retrospectively in that election. They looked at the past performance of the Republican Party, and they saw the recession. And so that favored, President Obama. Other forms of participation other than voting, you have conventional participation and unconventional participation. So conventional participation would be like someone who writes or calls their legislator, joins an interest group. Okay. Unconventional participation would be like someone who would picket or riot or just do something that was out of the norm to let their legislators know how they feel. So voting isn't the only way you can participate in politics. All right, so this low turnout that the United States have doesn't really matter. A lot of people argue it's not really a problem, and this is based on the belief that the preferences of non-voters are really not much different from those who do vote. So we see in countries, where they do have high turnout, the results of the election don't change whether they have low turnout or high turnout. So that could bolster that argument. Non-voting can also be driven by acceptance of the status quo. People aren't voting because they like things the way they are and the people who are in office. But then other people believe that low turnout is a problem, that voters are very different from non-voters, and the social makeup and attitudes of non-voters are pretty different from those of voters. And you've kind of seen that in some information I've given you. So non-voters tend to be low income, young, blue collar, less educated, and more heavily minority. And that's certainly very different from voters. So they would have different preferences. All right, and then last, ticket splitting. This is something that's been occurring more frequently. As I mentioned, parties have weakened, and as a result of the weakening of parties, people's loyalties to parties have also weakened. You have much fewer people expressing themselves as a strong Democrat or a strong Republican. Most people are weak Republicans or weak Democrats, or somewhere in the middle, and they call themselves an independent. So since they don't feel really strong party ties, they will sometimes vote for candidates of different parties for different offices in the same election. So you could vote for a Republican for governor, but then go down the ballot and vote for a Democrat for Senate. Okay? And so from 1960 to 1992, almost 40% of states holding simultaneous presidential and gubernatorial elections, that's governor, by the way, recorded split results. So this is something that's occurring with great frequency.